Hi, this is episode 3 of the Communication Toolbox, and today we will be talking about boundaries. My personal favorite definition of boundaries is one that comes from the author Henry Cloud, and he says, boundary is where one person ends and another person begins. What's interesting about boundaries, we talk about boundaries a lot, feeling our boundaries are disrespected, or how do I make sure I'm respected? How do I respect other people? And I think it can put the emphasis on the wrong part of what is really important about boundaries. What is important about boundaries is we are all walking around with this imaginary dotted line around us because we have personal property. There are things that each one of us invites into our own life because we value these things or we find these things are going to make our life more beautiful. And that is why we want to understand what boundaries are. So boundaries give us a sense or a picture of ownership. I have personal property. I'm creating this life that I feel has vitality and beauty. Sometimes I'll make mistakes and include the wrong things in. Nevertheless, I want to have something surrounding me to have an assurance that I know where I end and another person begins. So as we choose to figure out what things we're confidently pursuing and how to protect our own individuality, there is this challenge that is associated with boundaries as well. We determine our boundary, and that also gives us an accountability to say, if I'm including something in my personal property that is not working for me, I now have the authority to own these things or lose the things that are not working for me. I really like this old motivational speaker. His name is Ed Foreman. Oh my word, if you can find him on YouTube, he is so worth listening to. And Ed says, if you are full of it, you act like you're full of it. That is a great example of why we want to have boundaries. There's choice. There's choice around what we include in our lives, and there's also choice in how we maintain what we include in our lives. If we are full of it, we are either just letting that happen, we're not paying attention, or we're choosing to be full of it. So we can choose to not be full of it. We can choose to be pursuing beautiful things, to be choosing balance and wellness and understanding of who we are as soulful beings. And then the accountability further to this is the more positive things we have in us, the more positive people we will be attracting. Like attracts like. There is something about in healthy relationships with secure and respected boundaries, there's a shoulder to shoulder camaraderie that happens, because the more health and truth I am pursuing internally, when I come alongside of somebody else who is pursuing health and truth, there's this natural boundary orientation that starts to happen. Hopefully some of you have experienced this. So when we understand healthy boundaries, we can better determine when those boundaries have been violated. So there's just some simple things to consider with boundary violations, because either we have a healthy boundary or there will be some sort of effects of those boundaries being crossed. The number one way that we notice boundaries generally is physical boundaries. So I have the right, one of my boundaries is to protect my own body. And the more I can protect my own body, the healthier I will feel. However, if I'm not allowed to protect my own body, if someone else is breaching that boundary, or I am breaching the boundary of protecting my own body, there's going to be some sort of consequence, some felt sense of loss or pain. So there's a few other categories of boundaries that I just wanted to go over here, because it's really nice to get in depth about all of the areas that boundaries influence our life. So we have the right to choose healthy boundaries for our responsibility, for our attitudes and character. So we're responsible for our attitudes and character, and that allows us a healthy boundary. If we aren't being responsible for our attitudes and character, then someone may breach that, or we may breach someone else's boundary. Awareness of feelings and responsibility to feelings. So there's a healthy boundary around that. If not, we may breach someone else's boundaries, or someone may breach our boundaries if we're not taking care of our feelings. Proactive behavior and managing consequences. There's this accountability thing with our boundaries. How am I physically acting out on everything that I'm including inside? And is that breaching someone else's space emotionally, psychologically, physically? Or does it determine that they can then breach my physical space, emotional space, psychic space? So thoughts and a method for evaluating our responsiveness. Let me try and say that a little bit clearer. I think it's just easiest to say that we have boundaries with our thought life. Are we taking captive of our thoughts? Are we thinking about our thinking? Are we noticing our conviction about our thought life? And then as well, this can impact how others' our ability to breach or influence our thought life, or how we may be aggressive or breaching someone else's thought life. We have boundaries around our talents and our abilities, our uniqueness. The more we can have those boundaries, the more we can really celebrate those quirky, cool parts of who we are. If we don't have boundaries around our own uniqueness, our talents, and those beautiful just sidebars of our life, then we may just neglect them completely. Or we can feel easily shamed or humiliated when other people comment on these parts of who we are. We have boundaries for our desires. So desires is loaded, but when we're really considering it just in this list here, there's a lot of meaning and purpose associated. This is really important for boundaries. We want to have boundaries around our beliefs of what is meaningful and what is purposeful. This is definitely a hill to die on. This is something that you want to know what you believe. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. We don't want somebody imposing beliefs on us that we haven't really thought about. And boundaries allow us to make balanced choices. So again, the boundary, that imaginary dot, is around our entire wellness wheel. So the more we are aware of what's in the wellness wheel that makes up who we are, the more we can make those balanced choices and considering how all things occupy our time. If we are not living in balance, then our boundaries are super easy to breach, or again, we could breach someone else's boundaries. And then boundaries are really about our personal limits. There's things that we can't do. I can't play in the NBA. That's a boundary. It kind of seems silly, but physical boundaries or limits are something that are a natural reminder. I don't know if I'll ever be able to run a 9-minute mile. Somebody else can run a 6-minute mile. Like there's these things to just consider of what we're really, really capable of and where we are called to in those personal limits. So this is kind of a fun thing to dive into. I think that it's really important to consider what boundaries are actually about is what's going on the inside. It's always an inside job. There's so much inside of who you are and who I am. That is why we want to evaluate boundaries. It's how I respect me, and therefore I can respect other people. If I don't respect me, my ability to respect others is limited, as is my empathy, as is my ability to manage my behaviors or my communication. So without boundaries, our relationships are deeply, deeply impacted. All right, you guys, I got a little bit more on boundaries, but I'm going to save it for a 3.1 episode. Bye.